Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video we're going to review the helicopter crash of Francis Gary Powers, a lifetime CIA employee until he was terminated with extreme prejudice, and yes, in the usual zip code that we've become accustomed to, Sherman Oaks, Van Nuys, Canoga Park, Sepulveda Recreational Center, Chandler Boulevard, home to the CBS television cast Manson family, home to Angela Lansbury's daughter Deidre, who lived with the Manson family, the menacing Susan Atkins with her 9-month-old little baby boy. I can just imagine what a terror that would have been. Anyway, that's where Francis Gary Powers was murdered. Of course, obviously. Approximately 4 miles from his home in Sherman Oaks, about 6 miles from Captain Kirk William Shatner's home in Studio City, where his third wife was found at the bottom of his swimming pool at 10 o'clock at night. That's not normal, especially when she was a great swimmer. Anyway, it's close to Toluca Lake, approximately 6 miles from the crash scene in a baseball outfield at Sepulveda Dam Reservoir, and Toluca Lake, home to Roy Disney, the chairman of the board of Disney Corporation, older brother of Walt Disney, who lived up and over the mountain range, up and over Laurel Canyon, Coldwater Canyon, Benedict Canyon. At the bottom of Benedict Canyon in Holmby Hills lived Walt Disney, which is, a good 25-30 minute commute to the office, where Roy could be there in 5 minutes from Toluca Lake, which is right next door to the Disney Studios. All right, so where do I begin with Gary Powers? I'm flying up here in my SR-72 Lockheed spy plane. Whenever I say the word Lockheed, just immediately think CIA, all right, because they're inextricably linked. Lockheed is the CIA, technical surveillance. Now, I'm in an SR-72, and the only real difference between the SR-71 and the SR-72 is that I have digital controls and instrumentation, whereas the SR-71 used analog and kind of some primitive, very busy dials. And so I'm able to put my plane on autopilot so that I can communicate with my audience, my vast audience, and we can get down to business. All right, so just an overview of Francis Gary Powers. Let me just refer to some of the facts having to do with his background. So he was born in 1929. He was born August 17th, 1929, right? And he was born in Jenkins, Kentucky. All right, so he's a Kentucky boy. He's the son of Oliver Winfield Powers, who was a coal miner. His wife, Ida Melinda Powers, was his mother. His family eventually moved to Pound, Virginia, which is just across the state border, not too far from where he was born. He was the second child of 6 children. He was the only boy, so he had 6 sisters. All right, in terms of education, Gary Powers is what I'm going to call him. Francis Gary Powers did graduate with a bachelor's degree from Milligan College in Tennessee. He graduated in June 1950. He immediately enlisted into the United States Air Force, and he did that in October 1950, right after his graduation from Milligan College. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant by December 1952 after he had completed advanced training, United States Air Force pilot training, class 52H. He did that at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. Gary Powers was then assigned to the 468th Strategic Fighter Squadron at Turner Air Force Base in Georgia, and he flew the Republic F-84 Thunderjet. He was quickly married to Barbara Gay Moore, who is from Newman, Georgia. They were married on April 2nd, 1955. Okay, so that's going to make... Gary Powers was enlisted into the United States Air Force at age 21, and that was essentially in 1950. And then by the time he's married, he's 4 years older, so he's 25 years old. He marries Barbara. He's 25, and then this is when the CIA comes a-calling. The CIA recruited Francis Gary Powers during 1955, and then they had a series of hotel-motel meetings. It's all very clandestine, cloak and daggers. I think we've learned that what the CIA does is there's certain hotels that they do business out of, and they surveil their rooms. They plant listening devices. They plant video or imagery, digital imagery devices, like an Amazon Ring camera. They were doing all this stuff back in the 1950s with various spook equipment, and that way the CIA knows the room is clean and it's under their control. Anyway, Gary Powers got bounced around to a couple of hotel meetings with some vague, ambiguous promises. It was made clear that he would be involved with dangerous activities and be getting paid a lot of money. A lot more money than he was making at the United States Air Force, which he would continue to maintain his credentials at the Air Force whilst he's transitioning over to the CIA. That's typically your cover. Just like you might know people that work at a mutual fund company or at a charitable foundation. Maybe you know someone that works for the opera house. Maybe you know someone at the symphony. Maybe you know someone at a pizza parlor or a dance club or a cinema, a chain of theaters. Any kind of facility can be used for money laundering, that is the concealment of money, which charities can be done, and dance clubs and theaters. Nobody really knows the metrics of how many patrons came and paid money, right? So you can just drop 500 grand of drug deposits in there or payments for an assassin, and you can't tell what's what, right? And the military organizations are the first place that the CIA goes to recruit people. However, they do recruit people in virtually every industry, from science to religion to the Catholic Church, for example. You don't have to be a Jesuit to be involved with the CIA. You can be any number of another orders in the Catholic Church and actually be working for the CIA. Same as Hollywood, right? I mean, virtually everyone in Hollywood, 100% works for the CIA, whether they know it or not. If you're involved with acting and reading scripts and social engineering content, then you're working for CIA. Because they don't put my content out. You don't see my content, do you? Out there with Oliver Silverstein? You don't see my content out there. Oliver Stone is in a different category than I am. All right, so Gary Powers, I guess he passed the interview, and because I happen to have experience in the finances of these things, basically whatever you get paid, he was a captain in the United States Air Force by the time he was 25 years old, and whatever you're getting paid, so let's just use today's numbers. Let's say that as a captain or a colonel, that you would make, let's say, $120,000 a year salary. Well, multiply that times 10, and then that would be your additional compensation coming from CIA. So, in other words, this is how you get a 25 to 26-year-old pilot interested, right? You'd say, how would you like to be deemed an expatriate, which means at least 100 grand of your salary is tax-free. And if you live in Texas or Florida or Nevada, you pay no state income taxes. Doesn't mean you can't travel to California, to Palmdale, and to Edwards Air Force Base, but you'll be an expatriate and you'll be a native of some other state. All right, so this way we get around the state income taxes, and we take a chunk of your salary and exempt it because you don't really live in one place very long, is the expatriate rule. So essentially, that's what they did for Gary Powers. That's what they do with everybody. And it's very difficult for a 25-year-old man who just got married to turn down $1 million of additional salary. That money is not paid from the CIA, just so you know. They don't write you a check. They don't put you on the payroll. What you do is you receive a series of paychecks, which are not called paychecks. They're called consulting contracting fees, and they come from all manner of fake straw companies that the CIA controls, like United Air, Freight, Civil Air Command, the Civil Air Patrol has a series of shell companies. The company that Mr. Hassanfuss was shot down over Guatemala, you may remember the Iranian guns for drugs Iranian program run by George Bush and Oliver North under the Ronald Reagan program. Well, the company that paid Mr. Hassanfuss, who crashed the airplane, that company pays people like Gary Powers, pays people who fly the SR-71 or 72, or conduct surveillance, spy, and or terrorism. You should know that if you volunteer to be a spy pilot, it is very likely that you will be involved in the terrorism business. And I don't mean, monitoring other terrorists. I'm talking about you're the terrorist. In other words, if you have a super fast plane like I do, and you fly it within 1,000 feet of a Catholic church, you can blow out every window in that church during services. And if you fly it over, let's say downtown, hypothetically, Managua, Nicaragua, for example, during lunchtime, you'll blow out hundreds of windows in the buildings and scare the bejesus out of innocent civilians, which has been done. Okay? And it's done frequently. It's also, the SR-71 was used to fly over state funerals just to remind the Chinese or the North Vietnamese or the Russians that, hey, I double dare you to shoot me down. I bet you can't. And of course, you can't shoot a plane down that's going Mach 4 at 90 to 100,000 feet. There's just a lot of technical problems that Raytheon guidance system, missile guidance, hasn't figured out, because for every offensive technique, there's a countermeasure. So if Raytheon did design software that could intercept an object flying at 3,000 miles an hour, then you just easily write a program to evade it by changing directions just incrementally, up, down, left, right, up, down, left, right, up, down, right, left. And it's virtually impossible for the Raytheon guidance software to intercept you 100%. The missile can get very close to the target, but it'll never hit the target because you can have the same type of software inverted, and you evade. So what I want you to know from a positive point of view, with everything that Google is doing with their fake artificial intelligence publishing censorship program and their fake searches to evade you from getting to the truth facts that are out there in some archive, and Google doesn't want you to see the archive that you're interested in, just know that there's holes in their matrix. It's not 100% program. It will get rid of 99% of truth seekers, will be thwarted easily by these types of, I would call it Raytheon missile guidance software. It's sort of like Google search. It's not Raytheon, but it's like Raytheon. In other words, you're trying to get as close to the truth as you can, and yet there's an artificial intelligence tactic that is trying to evade your search. Okay? But I'm telling you that if you're persistent and you corroborate and you try lots of different databases, you can unearth some gems. But it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of passion. So, I would say that their system is successful because they have eliminated 99% of people. They've thwarted and counter-moved 99% of the population. They haven't stopped me, however, and they haven't stopped you who is listening to this video. So you should know that so Gary Powers is now in the CIA effective in 1956. We're going to call it January 56. He crossed over to no longer go to his Air Force meetings. And according to Wikipedia, he was discharged from the Air Force in 1956 after he transitioned as a rank of captain. But I'm telling you, that's poppycock, because my experience with spy pilots is they maintain their status as captain and then colonel. and they become a colonel in the Air Force, and they go all the way to retirement with the Air Force. Even though they're no longer going to meetings, they don't report to a general. They don't. They go to Air Force bases, but they don't speak to anyone at the Air Force. They deal with Lockheed, Pratt and Whitney, Raytheon missile guidance people who control a lot of the instrumentation. They work with contractors. They work with the fuel people from Shell. They work with a variety of different contractors. And when they're done being a terrorist spy pilot, it's inextricably linked. It's hard to know what's what. They go together, terrorist, spy. But when they're done doing that, they become test pilots, meaning they work closer with the contractors to make and break new products for the planes. Anyway, that was the path that Francis Gary Powers found himself on at age 25. And, so he pursued this reconnaissance, surveillance, espionage business, and he was quickly assigned onto the state-of-the-art spy plane of the time, the U-2. The U-2 spy plane, which for most of my life they've never told the truth about the altitude that this plane flies at. It's essentially designed after a glider. Its wingspan is actually wider than the plane is longer. I can tell you that it's virtually impossible to parachute out of a U-2 spy plane because the rear tail section of the plane is in close proximity to the cockpit, and if you attempted to eject, about half the time you'd have your head decapitated by the rudder, by the tail. The tail section of the plane is very close proximity to the plane. Now, is it possible to parachute out? Yes, and I even know a person who did it. He broke all of his molars in his mouth and broke his back because he parachuted out shortly after takeoff, and the plane was in an inverted position. So when I say he ejected, he went sideways, and he cleared the tail section, narrowly missed it. But the plane was going super duper slow, so that was, I think, why he didn't get decapitated, because the plane wasn't going, 400 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour. It was going, under 100 miles an hour when he ejected. So it is possible to do that. But I just want you to know that as a practical matter, no spy pilot ever parachutes out of the plane. They go down with the ship like the Titanic, okay? They're strapped in. They stay strapped in until they land at a CIA airbase where someone unstraps them, because they're usually pretty sweaty and they've had to go to the bathroom during their mission. So it's not necessarily as simple as the public is led to believe. So without getting, I have done a video on Gary Powers, and I don't want to redo it here, but he was maneuvered into to doing a false flag spy mission on May 1st, 1960. That was specifically designed to torpedo President Dwight Eisenhower's Crusade for Peace conference in Paris, France, scheduled for May 14th, 1960, which was going to include China, Korea, Russia, all NATO countries, all non-NATO countries, to sign a treaty for disarmament of nuclear weapons. And the banks and the CIA apparently objected to that. And because Dwight Eisenhower was now in his 8th year as president, this is his last hurrah, and he'd been stymied and prevented from doing what he really wanted to do during his presidency, he said, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway, right? With Premier Khrushchev. And so the CIA said, no, you're not. You're the president. You don't run the show. The banks run the show. So the way that came down was they sent Gary Powers up. They strapped him into his plane in Pakistan. And to be real specific about where that happened, I'll tell you where it happened. It happened in a place called Peshawar, Pakistan. at a CIA headquarter Air Force base. Well, it's a CIA air base in Umedabad, Peshawar, Pakistan. It's technically 10 miles south of Umedabad. It's, I don't know, 30 miles from the Russian border. It's really close to Russia. So when you take off from this air base, you can be over Russia within 6 minutes. And there are a minimum of 5 Air Force bases that the CIA uses in Pakistan. Now, when the news stories came out on this Gary Powers, of course, they all said that it was a mission from a weather balloon flown out of Turkey. So anyway, the liar, liar, pants on fire cover stories were all over for the first week of this Gary Powers gone missing story, which is just like the Anne Heche case, is just like the Sharon Tate murder. It's just like the Dr. Victor Ota murder, although they wrapped that up in 4 days. So that one, it's the old hobo in the creek bed did it. Took them 6 months to wrap up that Malibu Creek, California State Park murder. Took 6 whole months to find the guy that did that, whose ballistics didn't match up. But that's not the point. Who cares? He did it. Well, of course, they do that in every case. They do it in every case, without exception. Except in Zodiac, they never made an arrest. So I guess they didn't do it in Zodiac. But they did do a lot of liar, liar, pants on fire in Zodiac. And they did do a lot of liar, liar, pants on fire with this Gary Powers thing. Anyway, to make a long story boring, he spent 20 months in KGB prisons in and around Moscow. His plan conked out. It was a lemon plane. It was specifically designed to crash or to have the engine conk out. He glided and landed the plane safely in a farm field. We know that's true. He had over 13 pieces of personal identification, which were found under a seat cushion, which breaks all the rules. I can assure you that Gary Powers, a spy pilot, would not take any personal identification on his flight. So the CIA must have packed his bags, and they deliberately on purpose wanted those identifications to be discovered. Because actually, if you can show that you're a member of the United States Air Force and an officer in the Air Force as a captain, which he was, you can be shot on sight because you're 1,200 miles, inland and about 200 miles away from Moscow in a plane with a camera that doesn't work. They put some old junky camera in there. So it wasn't a spy mission. It was an international false flag mission. That was the point of the Gary Powers. Anyway, after about a year and a half and really bad food, he and a Yale master's degree student were traded for a alleged KGB agent in the Bridge of Spies episode where they swapped 2 for 1. So you got 2 Americans. You got Gary Powers, who's a captain in the Air Force and 5 years in CIA, and a Yale student who's at that time is like 26-year-old Yale student, and who studied economics and became a professor of economics after his Yale master's degree. And he was a spy. He'd been sent to South America, kind of like, Linda Kasabian's husband was sent to Rio de Janeiro. I'm sure that this character, and to be specific who I'm talking about, since a lot of people don't know the name of the person I'm referring to, I'm talking about Frederick Pryor. Frederick Pryor was born on April 23rd, 1933. So that makes him 4 years younger than Gary Powers. And Gary Powers was 29 years old when he was captured, and he was 32 years old when he was released. So Frederick Pryor would have been 28 years old when he was released. He attended Oberlin College and Yale University. Yale University is where Arthur Silverstone went. Oliver Stone. That's where Dick Cheney went but didn't graduate. That's where H.W. Bush went. That's where W. Bush went. George W. Bush went. That's where William F. Buckley went. Right? Isn't that where Jodie Foster went? Right. Yeah, she did. So that's where Abigail Folger's father Peter Folger. He went to Yale. Yeah, remember, he's the one that his daughter got bayoneted 28 times on the lawn on the Cielo Drive property, which is really up the hill from Sunbrook, where Oliver Stone went to go visit Timothy Leary, who happens to live in the house directly down the hill from where Abigail Folger was murdered and Sharon Tate was murdered. Yeah, so there's quite a Yale connection with things that will go on in Benedict Canyon and things that go on in Oliver Stone's films too, because he does have some Yale people involved with JFK and Columbia University, of course. You got to have them involved with the screenwriting, and of course you got to have Warner Brothers decide the final director's cut, because they're the ones that are going to distribute your product, and it needs to be final cut by Warner Brothers, obviously, or you're not going to get it. I mean, what's Oliver Stone going to go to on street corners and pitch JFK street corner by street corner? I don't think so. So anyway, Gary Powers is not happy about having to do almost 2 years in prison. He comes home. There's a whole series of Liar, Liar, Pants on Fire cover stories that the New York Times and all the usual suspects are running. This is not good for Gary Powers' marriage to Barbara. Gary Powers is actually confined to a CIA estate in Virginia and in Maryland. He is confined in some areas to be debriefed, and he spent more time in confinement upon returning than he ever did with the KGB, who didn't interview him as aggressively. In terms of, I think it was like 13 weeks that the CIA debriefed Gary Powers. 13 weeks is a long time when you've already been incarcerated for 20 months. And anyway, Gary Powers was very disappointed to realize that he had made a deal with the devil, and he really had. And this was his welcome home. Anyway, his marriage to Barbara began to deteriorate because he hadn't seen her in 2 years, right? And also the CIA looks like they might have introduced Gary to his new wife. So, to be specific, who am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the new wife, who goes by the name, it's where he had his only child, Gary Powers Jr. So we're talking about Claudia Edwards Downey. Claudia Edward Downey was a secretary for the CIA, I believe at Langley, Virginia. And she was introduced to Gary Powers, who had a troubled marriage, understandably. So they end up hitting it off, getting married. In 1965, he has Gary Powers Jr., who I don't know if Gary Powers Jr. actually knows the true story about his father, who basically landed this spy plane perfectly fine in a farm field, because Gary Powers Jr. goes on to work with Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks to do a fake documentary about what didn't happen to Gary Powers, which is that he got shot down by a surface-to-air missile. Poppycock on that. Completely false, untrue. That's like Apollo 13, another poppycock, fake Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, mendacity. But anyway, Gary Powers Jr. is getting paid for a book that I own, so you get a little money from me. It's a poppycock book, and just like this book is. This book was written by a CIA author, Kurt Gentry, right here. It's called Operation Overflight, which is a CIA program to fly spy planes and trespass. You don't have to be doing spies. You can fly over state funerals, or you can blow out the windows in a church, and that would be a project having to do with Operation Overflight. Anyway, you can't really blow out windows with a U-2 spy plane. It's too slow moving. It doesn't have that kind of horsepower. But at that time, you could take pictures. And back then, they admitted that it could go 60,000 feet up. Then about 30 years later, they said 70,000. But I'm here to tell you 100,000 is the correct answer, all right? It could go 100,000 feet up. Not that it did. It had that capability. It probably was about 80,000 feet. Doesn't matter. Whatever altitude that Gary Powers flew that plane, there was no surface-to-air missile that could take it out, over 80,000 feet. They don't have that kind of accuracy, even when you're going slowly, but you're still moving. Anyway, so the point is that that was 1960. Today is more problematic because, again, they have jamming software and they have evasion software, which can counter some of the accuracy. So for every tactic, there's counter measures, and that's always been true, and that's still true today with the Wi-Fi mesh. For example, if you insulate your home with copper wires, copper draperies, guess what? Then the CIA cannot surveil you very well. They're completely jammed up. So I do recommend that you consider insulating yourself in a copper suit, copper helmet, or a copper house, copper draperies, copper over your doors, and then you can get your privacy back, so long as you don't use your cell phone, or you put your cell phone in another part of your house, or you run the battery down real low. And again, you can do that. If you embrace copper and get rid of cell phones, you will be amazed how the CIA has no clue what the heck you're doing or where you are. It goes a long way. Even if you're vaccinated. If you're vaccinated and you insulate yourself with copper, it foils the whole point of the vax. It's a neutralizing effect in terms of tracking you with a mesh system. Anyway, Gary Powers, got the usual. He got a bonus when he came home. They paid him a lot of money. I forget what the amount is, but it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tried to make up to him, made him a test pilot for Lockheed, moved out to Edwards Air Force Base, started working in Palmdale for Lockheed as a test pilot. He wasn't going to be spying anymore. He wasn't going to be having to be a prisoner of the KGB anymore. And they never got along. And it didn't help that he was invited to the annual parties at the Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel, where Lockheed has all their spooks come. And Alan Dulles was there, and Kelly Johnson, who's the chief engineer of the U-2 and the SR-71 program. And he's a real arrogant person. And I want to emphasize arrogant. And he didn't make any friends with Gary Powers when those two met at the Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel near Santa Monica Boulevard. So he was unhappy. He was paid a lot of money. He was paid his continually high salary, which would be, today like $1 million a year. He was being paid. And that went on for 10 years until 1971, I guess. They just had enough. And Gary Powers separated employment and went to work for KNBC Channel 4 Nuys in Los Angeles, flying a helicopter for doing basically traffic videos and brush fires. And that went on for about 6.5 years. He worked for KNBC. He was assigned to San Fernando Valley. He moved to Sherman Oaks, which is basically in close proximity to the Burbank Skunk Works at the Burbank Hollywood Airport. And when I say that, I'm talking about Disney Studios. I'm talking about CBS Television. I'm talking about Paramount Pictures. Hollywood is where Lockheed is, at the Burbank Airport. And this is where the helicopter that Francis Gary Powers was flying for KNBC Channel 4 is, of course, kept at the Lockheed Burbank Airport. So that's not really a good thing, because I would prefer to have the helicopter maybe kept somewhere else. I'm not really sure where, because the CIA is in every airport on this planet, okay? I mean, they have at least 5 airports in Pakistan, so I'm assuming they're in every airport in San Fernando Valley. So I was going to say Van Nuys has an airport, but they're all over that airport too. So there's nowhere that you can really be safe, because if they want to tamper with your aircraft, they'll do it through the maintenance crew, and if you don't believe me, just ask Ethel Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's senior's wife, right? Because the last person to hold Robert Kennedy's hand was a Lockheed Skunk Works employee, Eugene Thane Caesar, who shot Robert Kennedy through the right side of his brain, behind his right ear. He worked for Lockheed. And this is who Francis Gary Powers is still dealing with, because his helicopter's parked over there. So his last flight he ever took in his life was August 1st, 1977. He was dispatched with a cameraman to Santa Barbara, Montecito way, where Ellen DeGeneres lives, where all the Hollywood spooks live up in Mendocino area, Rob Lowe, etc., etc. It's a long list. It's a long list of Hollywood people, as well as biotechnology people live in there too. Anyway, he flies up there. They take photographs of the flames and the fire, and then they fly same flight path that Kobe Bryant was taking. They just fly along Highway 101. You just follow the highway along, and you go past Thousand Oaks, and you go past Westlake Village, and you go past Calabasas, where Jose Enrique Menendez was going to build a house in the coming years. Remember, they were up there in 1987. So 10 years after Gary Powers flew past Hidden Hills, 10 years later, Jose Menendez moves in with his son Eric. Remember, Lyle is in Princeton going to college. He's not in Beverly Hills. He's not in Calabasas. The oldest son, Lyle, remained in New Jersey, Princeton, New Jersey. See, it's a little thing that if you read Dominic Dunn, or you read, if you view the fake video documentary by Karen Lamb, you'll never get the facts of the case of the Jose Menendez professional assassination. You're never going to get that because they don't want you to know about it. Anyway, so I'm talking about the Francis Gary Powers helicopter crash. He's on his way back to Burbank, and they said that he could just take lunch and refuel the helicopter, and they'd have another brush fire for him to look at later in the afternoon, because it's at 12:25 p.m. was the last communication that Gary Powers made to I believe to Burbank, to his KNBC contact at the airport. He's flying a Bell 206B helicopter. Now that's important, people. Bell 206B. His helicopter had both IFR and VFR, which is instrument flight route and also visual flight route capabilities. Doesn't matter. It's a perfect day. The sun's out. He's flying with visual flight capability. He's a U-2 spy pilot. He flew a U-2 spy plane and landed it from 80,000 feet up with no motor running, and he glided it down and landed it safely so that the KGB could find all of his identification under the seat cushion that he didn't even know was under there. So I would say that this guy can fly an airplane with or without power. And by the way, I can fly a helicopter without power because it's something called auto rotation. So you can aim your helicopter and pick up and gain speed or scrub speed, and so long as you have the aileron capabilities. But the rotors of the helicopter will prevent the helicopter from falling out of the sky. It is impossible for a helicopter to fall out of the sky, even if you have no skills. And I'm telling you that Gary Powers is one of the most highly skilled pilots on the planet Earth, and he's proven it many times. And a helicopter is a lot easier to fly than a U-2 spy plane, which is very dangerous. Those things get crashed. A third of the time that they come in to land, they have a problem with landing because those planes porpoise, and helicopters don't porpoise. If you know what I'm talking about, it's a technical term. Anyway, so Gary Powers with his cameraman, whose name is George Spears, they're somewhere around Sherman Oaks, which is right in close proximity to where Gary Powers lives with his second wife, Claudia. And right around there, he's got the little herky-jerky problem where it appears that he's running out of gas. And so he needs to look for a place to land in close proximity to Highway 101, which is the Ventura Freeway. And he's approximately 8 miles from the Burbank Airport. He's 4 miles from his home. He's 5 miles from the so-called Manson family girls' dormitory, which has been closed down now. And but he's only a mile from the Sepulveda Reservoir Park, which has at least 5 baseball diamonds. So that's what he eyes. Is he knows the Van Nuys Airport is over there, but he doesn't think he can make it. So he just aims for the baseball diamonds, And sure enough, no problem, he's going to land in the outfield of one of the baseball diamonds. Now, there were 3 teenage boys playing baseball in the infield of the particular infield of the baseball field that Gary had chosen. And after a number of mendacities as to what happened, and I have an article here to read you, I'll just cut to the chase. The boys said, hey, yeah, his tail blew off, and then the helicopter exploded, and then it crashed into the ground and killed, Gary Powers and George Spears. The boys didn't know who was in the helicopter. They just knew the helicopter exploded and then it hit the ground. But the media wanted you to believe that it was pilot error and Gary Powers ran the plane out of gas and therefore crashed. Even though all the helicopter pilots know you can auto-rotate down. And so later that story had to be modified to, maybe there was something wrong with the fuel gauge. They never backed off from pilot error, though. And that's how the Air Transport Agency, whatever that's called, that does the official fake investigation, they called it pilot error. Let me read you from the New York Times, which is a disgraceful periodical that I have a friend that graduated from Harvard that's a big shot over there, and she's a disgrace. She's a complete disgrace. And I can say that because she knows it's true. She knows that she's in the fake news business. And this is before she worked for New York Times. This is when she was, attending college. This is when she was going to Harvard. When she was going to Harvard, Francis Gary Powers, on August 1st, a YouTube espionage flight over Soviet Union touched off a crisis in Soviet-America relations. Well, it torpedoed the crusade for peace, is what it did. Anyway, so this is the New York Times wants to tell you about this. Anyway, so that was 17 years ago today, and he was killed in a crash of a helicopter that he piloted as a reporter for a Los Angeles television station, which I've already told you, it's KNBC Channel 4. The 47-year-old aviator, let me check that, it's correct, who had survived the downing of his U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union on May 1st, 1960. He died when his Bell Jet Ranger helicopter crashed in a Little League baseball field in the San Fernando Valley suburb of Encino. Yeah, it was the Sepulveda Dam Park and Rec. George Spear, a cameraman for the television station KNBC, also died. The initial indications were that the helicopter had run out of fuel. Mr. Powers, wait, it's Captain Powers. Mr. Powers was returning to the helicopter's home base at the Van Nuys Airport. Well, that's incorrect. His home base was the Burbank Hollywood Airport. Okay, so New York Times, that's strike one. Okay, after videotaping scenes of a brush fire in Santa Barbara, that's wrong, it was Montecito. All right, when his craft crashed at approximately 12:40 p.m. James Turner, an official for the Federal Aviation Administration control tower at the Van Nuys Airport, said that the tower received a radio message from an unidentified helicopter pilot at 12:36. The pilot said he was low on fuel and he was granted approval for an expedited direct approach to the airport. An official of KNBC said Mr. Powers had checked in by radio with his supervisors at the station at 12:25 p.m. and he was returning to Van Nuys for fuel. Incorrect. He was heading to Burbank. And asked what his next assignment would be, he was told that it would probably be assigned to another brush fire near Los Angeles that afternoon. Station officials said he mentioned nothing about being short on fuel. One witness told a fireman that the tail rotor of the helicopter fell off before the crash. In other words, in the air. But this was not immediately confirmed. I don't know what that means. I mean, there were 3 kids that witnessed it. Why don't you go ask them? The crash occurred less than 5 miles from Mr. Powers' home in Sherman Oaks in the San Fernando Valley. Yeah, and also about 6 miles from where Charlie Manson used to live, and about 6 miles from where Noel Bloom had his porn office in Canoga Park, about 6 miles from him, and about 6 miles from Toluca Lake, and about 5 miles from where the Manson girls lived, and about half a mile from where John Frankenheimer worked when he began his career transitioning from the Air Force to the CIA Hollywood as a director. He worked at an office there where the crash scene was. Yes, he did. And that's right where Gary Powers crashed, in close proximity to John Frankenheimer's, start of his career in San Fernando Valley in Van Nuys. Anyway, it goes on to say these other mendacities in here, but they got this part right. He's survived by his second wife, Claudia Edwards Downey, age 42. And she's the mother of Gary Powers Jr., who was 11 years old at the time of this crash. All right? So, his wife's daughter, he's also survived from his wife's daughter from a previous marriage, which he had, I'm not sure if he'd adopted, but anyway, they were married October 24th, 1963, which is shortly after his return from incarceration, after he divorced his first wife, Barbara Moore. He also got married, you'll notice, exactly a month before John Kennedy had his head blown off. Just throwing that out there. All right, there's more here, but it's pretty disappointing looking back at the New York Times, how they this is a story that obviously had been typed up in advance. It was published on August 2nd, which is real quick, like a bunny rabbit. So this was their initial story, and they seemed to know about that there was an explosion. And there's really no way they would have known that if they actually did, gumshoe reporting. And so I think that the reason that the New York Times knows that there was a tail rotor that perhaps maybe blew off was because it did. Because the helicopter had explosives on it, and it was remote controlled, destroyed by the invisible hand. That's my point. And we shouldn't be surprised, people, because look at how many murders there is in this area. I mean, this is where Jose Menendez worked. This is where Charlie Manson had a home for 9 months in Canoga Park. This is where the Manson girls were staged and cast so that they could be driven over to the Spawn Ranch for photo ops, then taken back to Van Nuys, Sherman Oaks. This is where, Phil Hartman was murdered in his bed in Encino, in this area. This is where William Shatner's third wife was drowned in his swimming pool within 5 miles of this crash scene. This is where the Ronald Reagan pistol was found in Sherman Oaks, down the hillside on North Beverly Glen Boulevard. Very walking distance to this crash scene. I can go on and on all day long. This is Spooksville, USA. So Gary Powers never really left Spooksville. And, he had to marry a woman who worked for the CIA. He had to work in San Fernando Valley, which is a CIA colony. He couldn't get out of the cult. They wanted him under 24/7 surveillance until the day he died, which was August 1st, 1977. Now, you should also know that Stevie Ray Vaughan, the blues guitarist, he died at age 35 on August 27th, 1990, in a Bell 206B helicopter, the same make and model helicopter that Francis Gary Powers was murdered in. Stevie Ray Vaughan died at 4:30 a.m. Gary Powers died around 12:40 p.m. in broad daylight. Stevie Ray Vaughan died in darkness at 5:30 a.m. at Berlin in Alpine Valley Resort in Wisconsin. And you should know that Wolf Grajonca, Bill Graham, the free concert promoter, worked for CIA his whole career. He was murdered at age 60 in a Bell 206B helicopter at Sonoma Creek and Highway 37, an area I know intimately. And I'm calling poppycock on that pilot error. They call that pilot error. They call the Stevie Ray Vaughan pilot error. It's always pilot error. Now, Wolf Grajonca crashed at 9:56 p.m. at night, and his helicopter had IFR and VFR, and allegedly they turned the instruments off and were under visual. Well, either method, you shouldn't get killed. That's a real busy Highway 37, and if it is foggy and raining, just drop down and follow the headlights, and just follow that all the way along till you get to Highway 101, then turn south, and you land pretty quickly at the San Rafael Airport, which is where he was going to land, because he lives in Corte Madera. So whether you had instrumentation or not, it should not have been a problem for Wulf Grajonca, who died with Melissa Gold, his girlfriend, and his pilot, whose name is Steve Kahn. So Steve Kahn, Melissa Gold, and Bill Graham were killed on October 25th, 1991, which is effectively 1 year after Stevie Ray Vaughan was murdered. Looks like he was murdered on August 27, 1990, which is approximately 13 years after Francis Gary Powers. All three killed in a Bell 206B helicopter. So that's a coincidence, right? Does that mean correlation? Well, I tell you this, Gary Francis Powers worked for CIA. Bill Graham worked for CIA. Stevie Ray Vaughan was in a Hollywood music cult, which is CIA. So all three people essentially are working for CIA, and all of them are using a Bell 206B helicopter. So when you add the fact that all three work for the CIA, and all three are in the same helicopter, and all three are attributed to pilot error, I'm calling that murder. I'm calling that clandestine service murder. Got it? So in that case, causation equals correlation and vice versa. That's what I'm saying. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Please hit the like and subscribe. Ciao.